On my wedding day, I entered the ballroom and found 9 members of my husband's family filling the main table while my parents stood beside the service doors, holding their menus. My mother-in-law glanced at my father's suit and sneered. "They look poor." I waited for Max to defend them. He nodded instead. 10 minutes later, I took the microphone before 150 guests and ended our marriage before the first dance. But the stolen seats were not the secret that ruined him. Max had no idea I knew where my father's missing $15,000 had gone or who helped him spend it. Before I reveal what Max did with my father's money, tap like and tell me where you're listening from. And if someone has ever mistaken your family's kindness for weakness, share how you handled it in the comments. Your stories remind people like me that standing up for those we love doesn't make us cruel. 3 hours earlier, I still believed I was walking into the happiest day of my life. My name is Charlotte Bennett. I was 30 years old, working as an interior designer, and convinced I had finally built the kind of future I used to sketch in the margins of my notebooks. That morning, my mother stood behind me in the bridal suite, fastening a strand of pearls at my ears. Her fingers smelled faintly of vanilla and butter, the same way they had every morning of my childhood. "Hold still," she whispered. Susan Bennett had spent most of her life baking for other people's birthdays, graduations, and Sunday dinners. Even on my wedding day, she had arrived carrying a cardboard box of pastries because she worried the bridesmaids might forget to eat. My father, Daniel, waited outside the door in a dark suit that fit a little too tightly across his shoulders. He had taught woodworking for decades, and his hands were rough from years of sawdust, splinters, and fixing things no one else wanted to repair. Those same hands had signed payments totaling nearly $50,000. My parents were not wealthy. That money came from years of saving, skipped vacations, and furniture my father repaired instead of replacing. Max knew that. He had sat at our kitchen table, looked my father in the eye, and promised he would always respect what they were doing for us. I believed him. I had been with Max Walker for 3 years. He was charming, calm, and good at making every uncomfortable moment sound harmless. Whenever his mother, Patricia, called my mother's bakery a sweet little hobby, Max said she was trying to be friendly. When Patricia suggested the photographer focus more on the Walker side because they were more comfortable in formal settings, Max told me not to overthink it, so I kept swallowing the small insults. That morning, Mom opened a narrow white box containing the place cards she had written by hand. She lifted 2 carefully from the stack. Daniel Bennett, Susan Bennett. She ran her thumb along the gold ink and smiled. "Front and center," she said softly. I kissed her cheek and promised her that was exactly where they belonged. Minutes before the reception, the venue manager approached me near the ballroom doors. "Charlotte," she said, lowering her voice, "I need to ask you about a $15,000 payment Max claimed he handled." My smile faded. "What about it?" She glanced down at her records. "We never received it." For 1 second, I thought I had misunderstood her. "The payment Max handled," I asked. The venue manager nodded. "Your father already covered the final balance. Nothing else came through from Max or his family." The hallway seemed to narrow around me, somewhere beyond the ballroom doors. Silverware clinked against china, and the band tested the first few notes of our entrance song. I wanted to call Max immediately, but the coordinator touched my arm. "Charlotte, the guests are already being seated." I forced myself to breathe. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe Max had sent the money somewhere else. Maybe the records had not updated. I clung to those possibilities because the alternative felt too ugly to touch. Then I stepped into the ballroom. The room glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. Champagne shimmered in tall glasses. White roses climbed around the columns. Everything looked exactly as I had designed it. Except the main family table, there were 9 seats. Every one of them was occupied by someone from Max's family. Patricia sat in the center, straight-backed and smiling, with Robert beside her, Claire across from them, and 6 Walker relatives filling the remaining chairs. Their place cards stood neatly in front of polished plates. Not one Bennett name remained. I scanned the room for my parents. I found them near the service doors. Dad held 2 dinner menus against his chest. Mom clutched her little purse with both hands while servers slipped around them carrying trays. They looked like guests who had arrived at the wrong event. I hurried over. "Why are you standing here?" Mom gave me a quick smile that never reached her eyes. "They are fixing something, honey." Dad looked toward the floor. "What table were you assigned?" Neither of them answered. Then I saw it. On the lower shelf of a service cart, beneath folded napkins, lay 2 white cards edged in gold. Daniel Bennett. Susan Bennett. Mom's careful handwriting faced down. My throat tightened. I picked them up and turned toward the main table. But Patricia's voice stopped me. I was partly hidden behind one of the flower-wrapped columns. She stood beside Max, smoothing the front of her dress as if nothing unusual had happened. Her perfume drifted toward me, sharp and sweet. Patricia glanced at my parents. "They look poor." She said it quietly, almost casually. Then she told Max their clothes would cheapen the family photographs. She said 9 Walker relatives belonged at the main table because they understood how to behave at an elegant event. I waited for Max to laugh. I waited for him to correct her. I waited for the man who had promised my father respect to show even a trace of it. Max looked toward the service doors. He saw my mother gripping her purse. He saw my father holding those menus. Then he gave a small nod. "They will be more comfortable standing back there until someone finds space," he said. "The table looks better this way." For a moment, I could hear nothing except the hum of the air vents and the pounding inside my ears. He agreed. This was not a seating mistake. It was planned. I stepped out from behind the column, crossed the ballroom, and caught Max by the arm. His face changed the second he saw the place cards in my hand. I led him into the hallway and shut the door behind us. Then I looked him straight in the eyes. Where did my father's $15,000 go? Max's mouth opened. But nothing came out. That silence told me more than any excuse could. I held up the place cards. "Start with the truth." He rubbed the back of his neck and looked toward the ballroom doors. "Keep your voice down. Where is the money? It was not stolen." "That is not what I asked." His jaw tightened. Then he said it. His mother had fallen behind on several personal bills. Max used my father's $15,000 to cover them. He said he planned to replace it after the wedding. I stared at him. "My father gave you that money for this venue. He gave it to us." "No, he trusted you." Max exhaled like I was the difficult one. "Charlotte, once we are married, this constant separation between your family and mine has to stop." I could still see Dad through the narrow window in the door. He stood exactly where I had left him, holding 2 menus against his chest. "You used his money," I said. "Then let your mother take his chair. It is one table. It is not about the table. Then what is it about I stepped closer? It is about whether you believe my parents are people or resources, for the first time." Max looked nervous. I gave him one chance. "Go back in there. Clear 2 seats. Put my parents at the main table. Apologize to them in front of both families. Then tell my father exactly what you did and sign a repayment agreement tomorrow." His eyes hardened. "You want me to humiliate my mother at my wedding, our wedding." He looked away. "That was my answer. You are blowing this up because Patricia made a comment. She called them poor. She cares about appearances, and you agreed with her." Max lowered his voice. "Do not destroy the entire night over this. My mother has waited years for a wedding like this." Something inside me went still, not shattered, not burned. Still. I finally understood that Max was not sorry. He was afraid of consequences. I opened the door and walked away before he could touch me. The venue manager was near the ballroom entrance. I asked one question. "Who has final authority over this event?" "You and your father," she said. "Both names are on the agreement. If guests refuse to follow instructions, we ask them to leave. Security steps in only if necessary." I nodded. Emily was standing with my parents. I placed the 2 handwritten cards in her hand. "Stay with them." Her eyes searched mine. "Are you sure I looked back at Max?" He was already whispering into Patricia's ear. "I have never been more sure." Then I crossed the ballroom, reached the DJ booth, and held out my hand for the microphone. The DJ looked at me, then quietly placed the microphone in my hand. The music cut off. 150 conversations died at once. Patricia turned toward me with a pleased smile, already preparing to accept public thanks. Max stood near the edge of the dance floor, pale and rigid. I lifted the microphone. Before the first dance, I need to recognize the people who made this evening possible. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. I looked toward the service doors. My parents, Daniel and Susan Bennett, spent nearly $50,000 on this wedding. They paid for the flowers, the food, the music, and every glass of champagne in this room. Heads turned. Dad lowered the menus. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. And yet, when I entered this ballroom, they were left standing beside the service entrance. A murmur moved through the room. I faced the main table. There are 9 seats at that table. Max's family took every one of them. Patricia's smile disappeared. Charlotte, Max said sharply. I raised one hand. My mother wrote every place card by hand. Hers and my father's were removed and left face down on a service cart. Patricia shoved back her chair. This is inappropriate. I looked directly at her. You said. They look poor. The room went still. That is not what I meant, she snapped. You said their clothes would ruin the photographs. Max started toward me. Enough. I turned to him. You heard her, and you agreed. His steps slowed. Guests were watching him now. His cousins shifted. Claire stared at the tablecloth. Robert removed his glasses. Max reached the dance floor. Give me the microphone. No. You are embarrassing yourself. No. Max, I am refusing to protect you from what you did. Patricia whispered his name behind him. A few weeks ago, my father gave Max $15,000 because Max said it was needed for a final wedding payment. Dad looked at me, stunned. The venue never received it. Max admitted tonight that he used it to cover Patricia's personal bills. Gasps broke across the ballroom. Patricia stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor. You had no right to discuss my finances. My father had the right to know where his money went. Max reached for the microphone. The venue manager stepped between us. Sir, keep your distance. His anger cracked into panic. This is our wedding. I looked at him. It was. The word landed harder than any scream could have. I gave Max a chance to restore my parents' seats, apologize, and agree to repay the money. He refused. That is not true. You told me not to ruin your mother's night. Several guests looked toward Patricia. She pointed at me. She is unstable. She has been waiting to turn him against us. I removed my wedding ring. I will be speaking with an attorney. I will not continue this marriage. I placed the ring on the sweetheart table. Max stared at it, then at the guests who now saw the man who took money from my father and left my parents standing. That was the moment the image he had built collapsed instantly. Patricia demanded that the DJ restart the music. The manager asked her, Max, and the relatives at the main table to leave. They refused. Voices rose, chairs scraped. Only then did security step forward. No one was dragged or threatened. They were escorted toward the doors while Patricia protested and Max kept saying my name like I still owed him an answer. I did not follow them. I took my parents' place cards from Emily and set them at the center of the main table. This is where my parents belong. Then I held out my hand to Dad. We still have a first dance. His rough fingers closed around mine. As the music began, Mom stood beside the floor crying into both hands. The wedding I had planned was over, but for the first time that night, I was surrounded by family. The next morning, I woke up in my childhood bedroom with my wedding dress hanging from the closet door. For a few seconds, I forgot everything. Then I saw the empty place on my left hand. The ring was gone. So was the future I had imagined. Mom knocked softly and came in carrying coffee. She set it beside me without speaking, then sat on the edge of the bed. I am sorry, I whispered, her face folded. For what? For asking you to ignore so much. She took my hand. You saw the truth when it mattered. That afternoon, I met with an attorney. I brought the venue payments, the messages about the missing $15,000, and the names of people who had heard Max admit what he had done. The process was not instant or dramatic. There was no courtroom speech and no perfect moment where everyone applauded. There were appointments, paperwork, uncomfortable questions, and nights when I stared at the ceiling wondering how I had missed so much. But slowly, the facts became impossible for Max to avoid. My father sent a formal request for repayment after the payments were reviewed. Max agreed in writing to return the full $15,000. Patricia helped him cover it by giving up several expensive social commitments she had once treated like proof of her importance. I never called Max's employer. I never posted the wedding video. I never asked anyone to harass his family. I did not need revenge to follow him through every part of his life. The truth had already done what it needed to do. Our marriage ended through the proper legal process when I signed the final papers. My hand trembled, but not because I wanted him back. I was grieving the man I thought he was. There is a difference. I moved into a small apartment across town. It had creaky floors, a narrow kitchen, and morning light that spilled across the living room like warm honey for the first time in years. No one told me I was overreacting. I started therapy. I learned how often I had confused patience with permission and compromise with surrender. A few months later, part of the unused wedding costs was returned. Mom, Dad, and I used some of it for a quiet trip to a coastal city at a small restaurant near the water. Mom pulled 3 handwritten cards from her purse. Daniel Bennett, Susan Bennett, Charlotte Bennett. She placed one in front of each plate. "No one moves us this time," she said. We laughed until Dad had tears in his eyes. When we returned home, Max sent me a long letter. He admitted he had spent years choosing his mother's approval over everyone else's dignity. He asked for another chance. I read every word. Then I placed the letter in a drawer and closed it. Later, in my parents' kitchen, I noticed the 2 wedding place cards framed beside a family photo. They no longer looked like evidence of humiliation. They looked like proof that we had finally stopped letting other people decide where we belonged. Love is not supposed to make you smaller, and silence is not the same as peace. The night I walked away from Max, I thought I had lost my future. What I lost was the fear that kept me accepting less than respect. If your family has asked you to tolerate cruelty just to keep up appearances, you are not alone. Have you had to protect someone you loved from family? Share your story in the comments. Send this to someone who needs it, and subscribe so you do not miss the next story.